Hello, everybody. This is Adam Elenbaas from Nightlight Astrology. Today is March 1st, 2018, and I'm doing a Nightlight daily video blog today on the topic of the Two Zodiac Debate. So I've titled this talk, The Two Zodiac Debate, Is One Zodiac Really Better Than Another? So in this talk, which I'm actually recording this talk using Zoom, which allows me to share my PowerPoint notes so that you can actually look on with the basic arguments and ideas that I'm presenting here as we go along. So in this talk, we're going to look at the so-called Two Zodiac Debate, which is sort of a hot topic right now. And the reason that I'm choosing to do this at this time isn't because I think it's such an important topic to figure out which zodiac is the best or whatever, but I'm doing this because of recent encounter that I've had and the circulation of a lot of debate and a little bit of a brewing controversy in social media in the professional astrology world right now, the Western professional astrology world. To summarize, we're going to look at how this debate has come to become. It's become like a hot issue lately. So how did that come to be? We'll talk about an East meets West astrology conference that I just attended in Calcutta, and how this issue of the sidereal versus tropical or Eastern versus Western zodiacs. That issue's always existed, but it's become rather hot topic lately in the wake of some controversy surrounding some talks that were given at that conference. So the question that we're going to be looking at is one zodiac really better than another? First of all, can we determine that? Is that possible? What are the arguments for both sides? And also, how do we define better? Right? Because that's an important thing here. If both systems are competing for, supremacy, if one zodiac is trying to prove that it's better than another, if we're trying to prove that one zodiac works better than another, then we have to talk about how do we define better and how do we define what works. So that leads us to also the other big question, which is, what is the purpose of astrology? What are the dangers or pitfalls of thinking also that one zodiac works versus better, versus thinking that both zodiacs work just as well? Because oftentimes that's what it boils down to. In a general sense, people will say either one side versus the other that works, this is superior, it's better, it's the best, or you'll have people be like, they both work. So what are the pitfalls or dangers of thinking that one zodiac works better than another versus thinking that both just work? And is one side of on that level, is one side truer than another? How is it that astrology works in the first place? How does the underlying metaphysical issues surrounding the fact that astrology can work at all come to bear on this debate? So there's some of the things we're going to look at in this talk. And the idea is for this talk to be pretty quick. I'm going to try to keep it under half an hour. The background of this talk, as I mentioned, comes from a recent East meets West astrology conference in Calcutta that I recently attended. Now, at this conference, there was a prominent Western astrologer who gave a talk about the supremacy of the tropical zodiac. I'm not going to mention names here because I don't want to get into that level of the issue. But we'll just say that there was a prominent Western astrologer at the conference who gave a talk about the superiority of the tropical zodiac, and argued that there cannot be two incompatible ways of measuring the zodiac, which is what the Eastern and Western systems amount to, different ways of measuring the starting point of the same zodiac that we all use. But the differences can be big, right? Like in one system, the measurement is quite different than another, and that can yield totally different planets in different houses and signs and aspects and so forth. So, at the end of the day, if everything's shifting around a bit, then there is real concern that we want this to work correctly, right? We want it. So maybe there is one that's better than another. All right. So this prominent Western astrologer gave this talk. At the end of the conference organizer, who's an Indian astrologer, gave a talk in favor of the sidereal zodiac, or I shouldn't say just in favor of the sidereal zodiac, but he gave a talk that was arguing a bit more in favor of bridge building, and was also a rebuttal to this other gentleman's talk, and offered some arguments that I think could be construed as in the favor of the sidereal zodiac. So it was kind of a back and forth in that regard. Now, since the conference, the debate over this topic has continued on social media. I've had a lot of students, readers, and clients who have been exposed to the debate online through various professional astrology forums, or following the chat lines and threads of different professional astrologers who are hashing all of this out. So I'm making this video just to chime in and offer my own thoughts within this ongoing community dialogue, for nothing more than the purpose of those who happen to tune into my channel. That's it. I also want to just say that there was a level of the issue that had to do with the feeling that this Western astrologer should not have presented in the tone or manner that he did at an astrology conference in India, claiming that the Western tropical zodiac is superior. Fair enough. So there's been concerns about that are more ethical. I'm not really going to go into that area of the matter. I will comment sort of generally on that level of the situation, but there was also a pretty intense reaction toward this astrologer, and there's also been, so there's been a level of ego investment for everybody. There's been some back and forth about the appropriateness, and also there's been conversation about how strongly some people are reacting, really trying to call this astrologer out and get him removed from committees and things like that. So that's been a hot part of the issue, but I'm going to comment on that sort of very generally and just leave that out of it and get down to the question that I think most of my students and readers have been asking privately and in class and stuff like that, which is just, is one zodiac really better than another? And how do you even determine something like that? Well, can both systems work? Is that a thing? How does that work? If both systems work, how does that happen? So that's really the purpose of this talk. Now, the premise of the debate between the two zodiacs is that since the dawn of horoscopic astrology, the methods of measuring the 12-sign zodiac have not been consistent. In the so-called Western tropical zodiac, by the way, we have probably pretty strong evidence that at one point, early on, the two systems were synced up. At the constellations and stars and the measuring of the start of the zodiac in a rough alignment with both the stars and the spring equinox gave us the 0 Aries starting point of the zodiac, in which case we probably started with a uniform zodiac. And in time, as the recognition, as there was the rising recognition that the stars were drifting relative to the equinox point, that there is divergence in terms of how the zodiac is being measured. In the West, we call it the Western tropical zodiac. This is not like people when we say the West, sometimes people confuse that with United States or Europe or something like that. We're mostly talking like modern Europe. We're talking about ancient Hellenistic astrologers in basically the Roman Empire, and coming from Greece, the heritage from Babylon, Mesopotamia, Egypt. I mean, so it's not just, sometimes West is used a little pejoratively. So I want to be careful with that, because we really do need to be respectful that this is a very diverse tradition. It's not, West and East is almost just a really misleading way of categorizing the debate in the first place. Anyway, Western tropical zodiac, though, we measure 0 Aries, the starting point of the zodiac, in alignment with the fixed seasonal point of the spring equinox. So every year when we hit the spring equinox, which is a fixed astronomical position that does not have anything to do with any particular constellations, it's when there is an equal amount of light and dark in the northern hemisphere that begins the spring season, and that vernal equinox moment from the perspective of the northern hemisphere is the starting point of the zodiac. Now, the in the so-called sidereal zodiac, we measure the start of the zodiac according to the gradual drifting of the constellations of the stars relative to the vernal equinox point. But there are a variety of different ways that sidereal astrologers have of gauging the starting point and measuring the starting point relative to the stars. And there is no universally agreed upon starting point for the sidereal zodiac, in India. There's different ways, sort of like there's different house methods here. There's also different ways of measuring the zodiac over there. Now, this is a really large and very old debate. One thing that's worth mentioning is this. In both systems, the zodiac itself is an ideal mathematical 12-part division of a geometrical circle that is defined by the ecliptic of the sun into 12 equal parts of 30 degrees. However, the starting point in the solar year is debated relative to, like, are we going to start it with the spring equinox? That's 0 Aries, which is not rooted in the constellation, so to speak. Or are we going to root that starting point in alignment with a certain patch of stars? And that's a more, in a way, it's anchoring the zodiac in the east more in terms of the a starting point aligned with stars. But the zodiac is still, regardless of how the starting point is aligned, in both systems, it's still a perfect circle divided into 12 equal mathematical parts that are not to be confused for the constellations, because the constellations are not 30 equal degree sections. So it's never been that the constellational zodiac long, long ago, prior to the standardized 12 sign zodiac of 30 degrees each, there were ways of measuring planets as they moved through actual constellations. But that was gradually sort of replaced, as I understand it, by this more ideal system of mathematical measurement. And the point is that both sidereal and Western astrologers use that. So there's really more in common in terms of the way we think about the zodiac itself than there is different. It's just how we measure that starting point of 0 Aries. Anyway, it's a very large and old debate, and actually I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on it today. But what I do want to do, I'd like to do, is recommend that my readers and listeners check out this wonderful podcast from my colleague Chris Brennan, who is one of the real ambassadors, torchbearers of traditional astrology in the modern era. He studied for a long time with Robert Schmidt, with Demetra George, done a lot of work with Ben Dykes. He's right on the forefront of trying to educate people about historical Hellenistic old school Greek astrology, which is arguably the place that all of this astrology comes from. But that's yet another debate about East and West that can be particular, so we won't get into that either. But at any rate, Chris hosted a debate on the subject of the two zodiacs a couple of years ago. I was in 2016 on his podcast, which is called the Astrology Podcast. You can check that out by visiting the link that I've put in here. It's theastrologypodcast.com. And then if you go into the archives in 2016, it was from, looks like it was from January, maybe January 3rd. It's called Zodiac Debate, Tropical versus Sidereal. Now, he's got Nick Dagan-Best on that show, and I can't remember the other gentleman's name. I think his name is Kenneth, maybe. But at any rate, they have a really nice debate about the topic. They really explore the ins and outs. So if you really want to know more and you're kind of new and you don't want something really overwhelming, it's a nice long show that really works very well for beginners. Now, you might have to pause, rewind, and listen to some of the key theoretical parts a few times. But if you really want to understand it, this is an easy place that I would have people go for an introduction. So we aren't going to look at that today. Now, at the conference, this Western tropical astrologer made his technical arguments for the superiority of the tropical zodiac. There were, as I mentioned, certain elements of his talk that were considered offensive, given the context of the talk. It's taking place in India, being hosted by a lot of sidereal users, and its overall agenda, the conference's overall agenda, which was bridge building between East and West. So why would you have this debate? Well, the gentleman who gave it believed that, this is basically the elephant in the room, as he put it, which was maybe slightly offensive given the fact that he's going to rip on the sidereal zodiac, saying this is the elephant in the room of the conference, while literally Lord Ganesha is sitting on the stage there as the sort of deity presiding over the conference. Which is interesting. It's like, okay, so you're going to go right after the elephant in the room. Be careful, because that's Ganesha you're talking about. But at any rate, so he really stirred the pot, and maybe there were elements of his talk that were considered offensive that really were. I wasn't actually there for it, so I didn't see it. The video is available online. It's circulating and stuff like that. I'm not putting it in because I just don't want to get into the sort of political level of it. I just want to try to address some of the intellectual issues that people have been asking about the two systems. Now, the host of the conference, again, closed the conference by making some solid counterpoints, but among them was also the claim that astrology comes from the ancient Vedic culture in India, and there was a sort of suggested, maybe implicit suggestion that it's therefore older and superior, which I have to be very honest, while I was in India, I heard way too much of that. I heard, there's a thing that I think is, it happens in all different kinds of cultures, which is that if you can claim that you have the oldest thing, then then my dad can beat up your dad. That kind of mentality doesn't take us anywhere. So, yoga is 50,000 years old, so it's superior to Christianity. Christianity is the Bible is 10,000 years old, so it's superior to Native American religion, or I don't know, just that kind of thinking in general. It doesn't, I really don't think it gets us anywhere. Understanding history is important, but the transcendental reality that the soul is working toward in this lifetime, that we have an opportunity to work toward, I think frequently is more important than getting lost in the mundane issues of historicity and nationality and all these levels of the debates of whose spiritual culture, technology in a mundane sense is older or wiser or something like that. So that part of his talk I was there for, and I thought, oh, I wish he wouldn't have gone there. But that might be just my own Western nationalism, kind of like, ooh, I don't know. But that was my honest response, is that, oh gosh. So there was a little back and forth here, and I wasn't there for both sides of it. So I've only seen the after video and the aftermath and stuff like that. But in my feeling of just being an observer and being there and seeing the mood and hearing a lot of conversations after all this took place, I think that there's an opportunity that was in some ways missed in both the general premise of the debate, both at this conference and in the world when people have it in general, which is that one side is better than another, right? That I think that the premise of trying to figure out, one side is better than another. That's a flawed place to start from, in my opinion. But the other opportunity that's missed is when we don't actually talk about how and why both systems work. If we just resolve to say, well, they both work, so let's hold hands and have dinner together and salute, and we drink our we raise our glass of wine and try to lose ourselves in a shared what are our common interests or something like that, but we don't actually talk about what those common interests are, or we don't talk about why and how both systems work and what they do when they both work. So that's kind of where I'm coming from, because I didn't feel like that conversation necessarily occurred, even though and I don't think it occurs often enough, just in general when this debate comes up. So we have to ask the question, what determines whether one zodiacal system is working better than another? Well, first, we would have to assume that both systems share the same goals, and therefore the results can be measured according to the same standards in both Eastern and Western astrologies. And this is problematic because I honestly don't think in the history of astrology and in general in the world right now that there's always been unity in terms of why you're doing astrology and what the demonstration of good results means or looks like, or what is how do you define the goals of astrology? And that's part of how you measure the results of both systems. And people within both systems don't agree and don't practice from an agreeing place about why you're actually doing astrology. Now, I think that's a real problem. But let's set that aside, because that's like a whole can of worms. Let's just say that the goal of astrology is predictive accuracy. That's okay. Everyone can probably agree to that. That would be a good definition for what would make one zodiac system as successful or more successful than the other. Predictive accuracy. Okay. Well, then we have to ask ourselves exactly what astrology should be able to accurately describe in a birth chart, what the astrologer should be able to accurately describe or predict, right? Well, again, that's a whole realm of debate, right? So you see how fuzzy this gets. But then if astrology should be able to accurately, let's just make it simple. If astrology should be able to accurately describe things, or things meaning character, personality, you can describe the feeling or the vibe of something, you can describe the inner quality of the experience in accurate terms. Or if you should be able to accurately predict elements of the past, present, or future in a sort of objective, concrete way. I should be able to say, you're going through a divorce right now, or your marriage is on the rocks, or I should be able to say, you're having a health problem this year, or I should be able to say, you're pregnant, or even maybe perhaps even slightly less concrete things like you're having trouble with your kids this year, or something like that. And those are actual, sort of testifiable realities that I can objectively predict. So that would be, I think, something we could all agree on. If astrology can accurately describe things or predict past, present, or future in a more or less objective way, and if both zodiacs can do that, then we have to say that both systems work. And what do we see? Yeah, that's exactly the case. We have a rich history of historical evidence, case studies, anecdotes, and testimonies from clients, practitioners, sages, saints the world over, right? I mean, we have astrology being used not in the Western context, not in the horoscopic context, but we have astrologers in the Buddhist tradition utilizing astrology in order to help locate reincarnations of famous lamas with great accuracy, right? We have people in India. Well, I'll tell you a personal story. So I've had an Eastern astrologer very accurately predict health problems in my family, right? Like very specifically. This is an Indian astrologer. And I've had an astrologer in the West using a totally different zodiac, which my chart ends up looking very different by. East and West, my charts look pretty different. But I've had an astrologer in the West predict the death of my grandfather, predict the major events in my career, predict moments of great strife or blessing financially. I've had Western astrologers accurately describe my psychological constitution with great detail of behavioral stuff that I've dealt with at different times in my life. And I've had Indian astrologers do the same thing, both psychologically and in terms of concrete prediction using two different charts. Now, I can only speak to my own experience of that, but in terms of the predictive, objective accuracy, the symbolic orientation of both charts was able to speak truth predictively. Okay, I would honestly say that that's not an uncommon experience. That we have a rich history of anecdotal evidence, case studies, testimonies from clients, practitioners, saints, people all over the world in both zodiacs, both symbolic orientations of the birth chart, able to accurately describe or predict. Now, some people aren't as into prediction as they are description. Fine. Doesn't matter. The results able to be performed repeatedly with great success in both traditions. There's also, a fair amount of evidence of people getting it wrong, of it not working. And there's a history of people saying they prefer one over the other. They feel that one is more accurate over the other. Okay, so it all exists. It's all there, right? But we do have, in terms of a history of anecdotal evidence, and which is basically all that astrology has, because we don't statistically test or study astrology. It doesn't seem to actually be testable in that way. But we have a rich history of charts with specific dates of predictions and time lords, and predictive techniques that are very similar. And so at the end of the day, the two zodiac problem doesn't seem to change the fact that both systems can accurately describe or predict. But at this moment, I think it's really important to sort of pause and ask ourselves the question: if both systems are demonstrating similar predictive or descriptive results overall, then what is the purpose of these results? Why are we seeking them? What are they in service to? This is really what brings us together. This is really the place where East meets West. Traditionally, here's the thing, is both Eastern and Western astrologers shared similar moksha philosophies. There's a word that means liberation. Both Eastern and Western philosophers, metaphysicians, mystics were concerned with the liberation of the soul from the material body. Now, if you don't believe me, hold on. Two wonderful books that I would recommend for a very thorough and academic study of this issue of the similarities between the moksha philosophies of East and West. This is the first one. It's called The Shape of Ancient Thought. And this is a comparative studies in Greek and Indian philosophy. Now, Greek, remember, Hellenistic world we're talking about. It's not necessarily all ethnically Greek. And then there's another one called Universe and Inner Self in early Indian and early Greek thought. Very similar type of book. And these are the timelines, the time periods where horoscopic astrology is blossoming. So we know that there's a melting pot of very similar metaphysical values that are being shared at the time that horoscopic astrology is dawning. Now, what are moksha traditions? They're concerned with the liberation of the soul from the material realm. Very, very simple. You've heard this before. You are an eternal spirit soul. You are not your body. However, in this material world, you incarnate in body after body and mistakenly get identified with the material world. The nature of the material world is impermanent. It's always in flux. It's always changing. And therefore, the happiness that you seek in material terms is never obtainable. It's like a deer going after water in the desert. It's a mirage. It never actually arrives there because there's actually no such thing as the water, right? It's an illusion. So similarly, all these moksha traditions, which most major world religions are built on philosophically, all share the similar premise that the soul is not going to be able to find water in the material world. Pizza won't make you happy. The marriage, it can only make you so happy. It's also going to provide you with suffering. Children, money, wealth, all this stuff that we go after and we spend so much of our time with that eventually doesn't take us anywhere, and we all have to die. There's really one place we're all going, and that's to die again. So the moksha traditions are concerned with liberation of the soul, that animating eternal consciousness that we each are. We're each a part of. We are each little like sparks of God. These are different ideas, of course, but at any rate, within the moksha traditions that astrology arises within, the planets and stars that make up the map of the birth chart, or the whatever kind of chart we're using, are thought of in both philosophical worlds, East and West, as administrators of fate or karma, like keepers of cosmic law, the things that administer the workings of the material world and all of its ups and downs and its gravity and the vacillating between qualities like hot and cold, wet and dry. This material world is constantly churning out cause and effect, cause and effect, cause and effect. And the planets and stars are thought of as administrators of that that constant cyclical unfolding of material birth, life, old age, disease, death, birth, life, round and round. They're thought of as gods by some, demigods in service to a superior monotheistic god in some traditions. And they're also described as false prophets, things that take us off from a true path, grabbers, demons, things that can grab you, etc. So in some ways, the planets and stars of the birth chart are all originally thought of as reflecting the errant desires of the soul that get the soul lost in the material world. That the planets are like the mirage. They're a symbolic representation of the different mirages that the soul keeps going after cyclically and predictably, with predictable results over and over again. And this is from the gross levels of events in our lives that are more or less predictable on some karmic or fated level, down to much more subtle levels of material reality, still governed by the laws of the material world, but much subtler, like psychology, character, behavior, heredity, genetics. So the all of the material sphere, from gross to subtle, is sort of being gestured towards symbolically by the cyclical dynamics of the planets, which themselves demonstrate a kind of predictability. But all of that is the birth chart, in other words, is not who we are, but it's a reflection of our material karma as souls trying to find a way back to God. Now, there's lots of different ways of talking about it. If you're uncomfortable with the language of God, I mean, the variety of moksha traditions on our planet and the different ways in which they talk about the liberation of the soul are very diverse. And this is the point where I tend to favor metaphors like many streams coming down to the ocean or something like that. But the point is not to quibble so much about the varieties of moksha traditions as much as it is to say that the entire language of astrology is thus traditionally in service to trying to accurately describe the karmic and material encasement of the soul in a particular lifetime, in a particular body, in a particular karmic environment. So if that's the real purpose of astrology, we have some truths that come out about material reality. Material reality is therefore multivalent. When we get down to subtler levels of materiality, although it exists on gross levels as well, material reality is you can't grab it. It's in a sense like trying to grab water with your hand, right? And it's because it's impermanent and it's constantly in flux. That means it's also perceptual. The nature of reality is in some ways, it's like one of my colleagues, Rick Levine, talked in response to this. He wrote an article that was really interesting, and he mentioned the particle wave duality in metaphysics, quantum physics, quantum mechanics. And it's very similar to that on subtle levels, especially the subtler you get, the less gross, the more that materiality, to accurately describe something is challenging, and it can be done from there's a variety of different ways linguistically that we can accurately describe something, the subtler we get, in life. So in other words, there are multiple different ways of accurately addressing material reality, because material reality itself is fluxional. So that's why you'll hear some astrologers saying that archetypes, the symbolic language of astrology, is multivalent. The symbols of astrology allow for a certain kind of flexibility in accurately describing the quote unquote objective reality that we experience. It's not to say that there is no objective reality. It's to say that the experience that we have of objective reality, like this morning, I'm recording a podcast, right? So that's, something objective, but there are still a variety of ways in which symbols of astrology could accurately describe or reflect that activity. right? That's what we're talking about. So there are multiple different ways of accurately addressing the gross and subtle levels of karma that we are born into. Again, from bigger experiences like events, I'm making a podcast, to subtler levels of behavioral, mental, physiological, or even hereditary patterns, really, really subtle stuff. So the fact is that all of material reality demonstrates this fluxional quality, and therefore the language, any kind of symbolic language that's being used to describe it, is also going to demonstrate that kind of flexibility. And it can, so we can address reality accurately, but there's still always a perspectival range of deliveries, if that makes sense. So the point in describing these patterns, though, what is the point? The point in describing these patterns accurately, or being able to accurately describe or predict more concrete events, subtle or gross, is to aid or guide the soul in detaching from association or identification with the material realm. It's a great paradox. It's like saying, once astrology has the power as a symbolic language to clearly articulate something that's true about you, that's true about life, and when the soul is able to sort of recognize itself in distinction, because something consciously processes and sort of recognizes the reality that's being described objectively, right? And so as soon as that kind of a seemingly objective description is made, consciousness has a reflection. It has, in that objective description, it says, yes, that is me. That describes me, right? And then over time, more and more of these predictions and descriptions are made accurately, and the soul starts saying, oh, and it changes from, yes, that's describing me in my life, to that's my life happening, and I'm a consciousness that's separate from the life, and I'm experiencing it. So the soul gains a kind of healthy distance through the predictive accuracy of this symbolic language. Consciousness itself is free. It's not bound up in the actions and reactions of the material world. It's not bound up even in the choices and all the material stuff that we do that we think ultimately matters in some sense. In this material realm, all of those material results just constantly go cycling through familiar levels of growth, and then reaching a point of entropy and decay. Around and round it goes. So the consciousness, eventually seeing more and more of these fluxional states described accurately by the language of astrology, starts to recognize, oh, I'm not all of that. That's not me. I have some kind of fundamentally distinct identity from all of these fluxional states that are being described, from behavioral subtle levels to, again, gross physical events that are predicted. So consciousness discovers itself as free, lucid, eternal, and distinct from the material realm through which it is passing. And that is thought of as so astrology in that sense is thought of as facilitating the liberation or awakening of the soul. That's what it's all about. So if this is the real purpose of astrology, and we agree that materiality itself, the stuff that's being described or predicted by astrologers of all kinds, is multivalent, then what matters most is that astrology facilitates the liberation of the soul through its accurate descriptions and predictions. That's how we measure if astrology is working. It must predict and describe, however. It can't do just one or the other. Prediction captures a certain level of seemingly objective reality, and description captures a certain level of seemingly subjective reality. It's like the particle and the wave that my colleague Rick talked about. The ability of the symbolic language of astrology to capture both elements of human experience is necessary, because the ego will easily start to conflate itself with, mistakenly, it starts to identify itself with the events of its life. And then sometimes it says, no, I'm not the events of my life. I'm the inner quality of experience. I'm the subjective feeling level of my experience. And that's just a different subjective level of false identification. So both sort of psychologically descriptive astrology and concretely predictive astrology can both falsely encourage the ego to get identified with the material realm. subjective material reality and objective material reality are two sides of the same coin. They both reflect elements of the experience of material reality that the ego can very easily get lost in. Again, so the ability of both descriptive and predictive astrology to get in there and say something accurate, though, is still meaningful because it's facilitating the same distancing process or healthy separation process of consciousness from the events and experiences of material life, of which it is passing through. It's not going to, this stuff will fall. We are all going to die, right? And then who you are, the conscious soul that you are, lives on. So we're doing all of this. Again, we need both predictive and descriptively accurate forms of astrology. Now, one thing is generally true. In the West, we tend to value subjective description rather than objective prediction. And the reason for this is often really unexamined. In the West, we say, well, predictive astrology makes me get identified with the events in my life, and really I'm the inner experience. I'm the inner qualitative psychological responses and life, and I'm the psychology. And the reason that we feel that way, I believe, in the West is largely associated with the fact that our egos have a lot more freedom. In the West, we're not nearly as constrained by money. Even people who are like in lower income brackets here are relatively wealthy to an amazing amount of people in the world. So there's a huge amount of opportunity here, and opportunity has a lot to do with dollars and money. And with opportunity, there's the ability to have a lot of experiences, have a variety of experiences. And of course, then you start to see through the temporal, transient nature of objective experiences, and you will naturally start to value the reality of the inner subjective experience. And as that happens, it's very easy to then say, well, that's the real thing, right? And so no concrete predictive astrology, please, right? But actually, concrete predictive astrology is like a homeopathy for people who are lost in the subjective dimension of ego. The more that you're just lost in psychology, the more that predictive event-based astrology can help take you out of the kind of hubris of sort of psychological navel gazing. It can take you out of the hubris of that more subjective inner dimension that we love to cozy up to because our egos have we've placed more value on that, in a sense, in the West. In the East, it's fundamentally different. People are more, there's more, I would say, generally speaking, there's more constraint, right? There's more constraint in terms of what's possible in a more external sense. Money, external events and experiences. The society is developing still in terms of like worldly stuff. So over there, the one of the reasons that the objective reality is more, in some ways, privileged more is due to the way in which external reality is experienced as much more constraining and sort of like real. So that the experiences of how we place a value on what kinds of experiences we're having shape the way we think about the accuracy of astrology. So all those things are really important to consider, and we have to go back to this question of why are we doing astrology? And when we really look at the metaphysical values of the Moksha traditions that all astrology comes from, then we understand that the predictive or descriptive accuracy, psychological or event-oriented prediction, which in some ways broadly defines East versus West moods in astrology, if they're not both, if we take a moment to just understand that they're both trying to facilitate that process of recognizing consciousness as our conscious agency and sentience as separate from the material karmic circumstances of the world, it becomes actually very easy to see that both zodiacs and the results of both zodiacs are in service to the same thing. Both psychological and event-oriented prediction are in service ultimately to the same thing, if we choose to remember our metaphysical roots, which involves a kind of faith. Now, why does astrology work? Let's talk about that. Because it's a symbolic system of divination. So basically, It works because it's a symbolic system of divination. Divination is a simple term I've done a whole thing on why does astrology work. It's another video you could check out. But divination is a simple term whose etymological roots mean the power of foreseeing or prediction. Also, the phrase also means, or the word also means to be inspired by God or a god, right? So in other words, there is a rich spiritual history of divination on the planet that is not just anchored to astrology, but that in general is about getting in touch with a kind of God's eye vision, predicting in order to be in touch with God or the power of divinity. So the close proximity of all forms of prediction on the planet to separating the consciousness and soul out from its false identification with the material reality, that's what all of these traditions share in common, in my opinion. That's really where the roots of the word divination come from. Now, the intellectual or logical rationale and origins of horoscopic astrology are really fascinating and deep and way too complex to sort out. But you can get into that too. I mean, there's amazing ways of talking about how and why this particular brilliant system of astrology works. So I don't mean to just be trite about it. But what I just want to add is that in the world history is teeming with various systems of divination that work, and astrology is not the only one. So if we really want to have a conversation, we should be talking about not do tropical versus sidereal zodiacs both work, but how is it that the I Ching, the tarot, the Chinese zodiac, the casting of runes, the reading of liver entrails, augury, divination in dreams, shamanism. We should really talk about how it is that traditions of all kinds have managed to use different forms of symbol in order to accurately interpret the soul's material experiences in order to separate out and emphasize the uniqueness of the soul in contrast to the material world that it's passing through in a particular lifetime or within a particular season of life or whatever. There's also a rich history of astrological forms of divination from all over the world that are not based in the 12-sign zodiac, including astrology from Australia, the Aborigines, Oceania, North America, South and Central America, Africa, Egypt, China, among Jews and Christians, Islamic practitioners. Goes on and on. If you ever want to read a great book on the presence of astrology in world religion and world history, this is a great book by Nicholas Campion, Astrology and Cosmology in the World's Religions. And he really visits all of the unique ways in which astrology is present in world religious history. All different kinds of people have used different forms of astrology to do very similar kinds of things, and they work. And if you don't think that they work, if you're that arrogant, then I'm surprised that you made it this far. I'm just kidding. All right, so you can tell how I feel about it. All right, so now the pitfall of thinking that one zodiac is better than another lies in forgetting the divinatory roots and the metaphysical purpose of astrology. As long as we stay stuck in the technical debate, and we miss the forest for the trees. And that's just obvious. Like most people can spot that from a mile away. But on the other side, the tendency to say, well, it all works. That's also problematic. And this is sort of my, level of commenting on the whole thing that's unfolded. Because if we're only saying it works from a kind of utilitarian materialist standpoint, well, I had a good reading, he had a good reading, and they were in different zodiacs, or I predicted this or predicted that. No, so it works. Well, the truth is that the real measurement of how astrology works is not just in its predictive results or descriptive results. That's the first level. But the real root level that provides us with the sense of why they both work is that we have evidence that they have participated in the facilitation of the liberation or awakening of the soul from within the material confines that astrology is accurately describing. That's what we really have in common. And if we're just getting together and if we say it all works, but we never define how and why, we're not building bridges. We're sharing egotistical and materially self-motivated concerns. We're functionally saying that they work. we need to talk about the fact that they spiritually work, because that's the primary reality. That's the reality that lives on after this stuff no longer works, because the planet is gone, because the star system is gone, because the universe has died, right? Because that's what happens in the material world. So if we're not really cognizant of that, then all of this is just us, basically giving each other a big salute and drinking to forgetfulness. And that, to me, that's like the real thing that I remember, that this is a phrase that I know is kind of heavy and sort of Christian sounding, but it's really true. The path to hellish experiences are paved with good intentions. That's true in my life. I know that's true in a lot of people's lives. Real bridge building in this topic requires that we look at the common metaphysical goals rather than just sort of materially celebrating the commonality of our interests or accomplishments, that we share a similar pride or ego or vanity. All of that is it's mistaking the fact that both astrologies work in service to the soul for the material measuring sticks of success. Big problem there. That's not going to bring us together. All that's going to do is it's a kind of false bridge that would be built. It's not a real bridge. Now that's my strong opinion. So you can take that or leave that, But one of the easiest reasons we get stuck in the debate is also because we get overly identified with the birth chart or its descriptions or predictions. So of course, people are going to always prefer one zodiac over the other because they like one description of their ego or material situation better than another. But the real test isn't which version of the description you like better. It's which astrologer and astrology, moment of astrology, experience of astrology facilitates accurate description or prediction, specifically so that you can be liberated from the concerns of the ego. Now, that's a different agenda, and it's a little bit more challenging to accept that dimension of astrology. That's like taking medicine that tastes bad but is good for you. Now you can also tell where I come from 10 years of drinking ayahuasca, which is a big part of how I came to astrology. And a lot of ayahuasca is drinking a bitter medicine that helps you with something. So I'm betraying my own spiritual experiences there, I guess, but that's it. But I experienced that in a lot of traditions. I experienced that in having to have any kind of daily sadhana, spiritually speaking. It's not enjoyable to do a daily sadhana. It's like medicine. You have to trust and have faith that the process of a spiritual practice is liberating you, but in the beginning, it's usually painful. It's not easy. So we have to always remember that in the midst of all of this as well. In conclusion, I hope this talk helps people think through the debate from another perspective. I think that the fact that people were offended by this debate at all is in some ways just as naive as the fact that someone got up and thought that the debate could be solved by shotgunning the solution, and being maybe a little rude. I think that both can be, not that both were, but both responses can get lost. Technical debates within fields like astrology, to me, aren't much different than the world of politics. I can't turn on CNN because all I experience if I turn on CNN is the polarization. Political life is polarizing. The words are etymologically the same. So we have, they're very similar. Political life is about polarization. Polarization isn't a bad thing. Within a proper understanding of material reality, that material reality is always cycling through polarities, and that's just part of our material experience, a healthy engagement with spiritual detachment within the polarities of life can lead to unity and diversity, which is beautiful, and that's what we should be going for. But without the proper understanding of material reality, without the proper metaphysical grounding, without the spiritual perspective of the moksha traditions that our craft is built on, it leads nowhere and becomes about who's right and who's wrong, or who's most offended, or who's the greatest offender. I see a lot of that in the world right now. I call it psychic nationalism. This is a tendency, in my opinion, of the ego to defend its values, worth, and position in terms of various group identity categories. And I think this is really a result of postmodern consciousness. The more that the ego identifies itself with all different kinds of group identity factors, rather than understanding itself as a spirit soul whose inherent identity is equal to everybody else's, The more the ego does this without recognizing this inherent equality of all beings on a spiritual level, the more these group identity categories become the source of conflict. Whereas, and then those conflicts are a sign of unhealthy egos that aren't in conscious alignment with transcendental reality, and it's just a never-ending back and forth between blue and red states, and on and on the conflict goes, and it does not resolve itself. It gets worse. However, the conflict is unavoidable. The polarities exist. We're here to experience them, not run from them. So when we reorient ourselves to placing spiritual reality first, the non-dual reality of our spirit soul, the eternal reality and equality of all beings, we can participate in the same tensions, but we can do so with a different perspective, a different mood, a different approach. We can have a debate about the two zodiacs, but we can do it from within an understanding of our shared metaphysical value. And that leads to something better than right or wrong. That leads to unity within diversity. That leads to technologies politically, socially, astrologically that are innovative and that maintain differences, boundaries, etc., but are also open to fluid exchange, open to conversion. And it's very you can't get there without placing the spiritual reality first. So that's what I've got for you guys today. I hope that this was an interesting talk. I've been, thinking about this for several weeks now and sort of percolating on the topic. So I offer these thoughts humbly with much love and respect to all my friends and colleagues, and in love and respect to the divine that lives in all of us, and that I believe astrology is helping us to be in service to in our lives. Okay, you guys have a great day. Take care. Bye.